All right, looks like we are live now. So in the interest of keeping the discussion lively and moving, we will get started. My name is Jonathan Bench. I am a partner with Harris Sliwoski in Salt Lake City. I'm joined today with my partner, Dan Harris, who is one of our namesake partners, of course, and our colleague, Fred Rocafort, coming from Florida. So we have a good array, good geographical array within the U.S., but also and a good array of expertise, I think. I mostly am a corporate or commercial attorney. I do business deals with Chinese companies and with U.S. companies and other foreign companies in China. A lot of my work centers around setting up the relationships the right way, or sometimes dismantling the relationships when things have gone bad or we need to adjust for one reason or another, which happens quite a bit now as we've seen a lot of supply chain disruptions. Dan Harris is Dan, you are a litigator by trade, but I think you've become much more of a generalist probably as you have dove into China. Maybe I'm misstating that, but you always come from a litigator's perspective, but I think your overall business sense very sharp, and that's coming from someone with much less experience than you in life, but someone who's been in a lot of conversations with you around international business. And then Fred Rocafort is Fred's my IP guy. He's my go-to for everything IP, whether it's in the US or China or anywhere else in the world. And so when the format of this today, we're going to have Dan start with an introduction, kind of a good overview of what he's seeing from his perspective in China business generally. Then I will talk a little bit about some of the significant legal developments in China, particularly since Xi Jinping took power in 2012. And then Fred will give us a perspective on trade and what the supply chain retooling has meant for his practice and kind of the global market. So, Dan, Fred, if I misstated anything or I just didn't do you justice, feel free to add some comments as it's your turn to speak. But let's kick it over to Dan to start.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I guess I do probably come after everything from a litigator's perspective in that I'm always very skeptical and very worried and believe that research can conquer just about everything. So I'm going to be talking today about the economic challenges facing China using facts and data and what our law firm has been seeing. China's economy is in serious trouble. Since 2021, its stock market has declined by around $6 trillion. To put that in perspective, that is more than the total gross domestic product of Japan and Spain combined. Foreign investment in China's stock market is down nearly 85% since 2021. China's largest real estate company, Evergrande, is in default on around $325 billion in debt, and it recently began liquidating. I personally know several people who simply cannot sell their properties in China. Closer to home, from 2003 to 2018, our law firm would each year help 5 to 15 foreign companies form subsidiary companies in China so they could legally conduct business in China. Since 2020, we have not formed a single such company. Many companies previously committed to going into China with a subsidiary company with its own employees are now opting to stay at home and license their technology or brand names to Chinese companies, or contract with Chinese companies to have them distribute their products in China. Though we've seen a downtick in company formations, we have seen a big uptick in such transactions involving licensing and distribution as foreign companies seek to reduce their China risks. Also close to home, our law firm has been getting a ton of phone calls from companies owed money by Chinese companies and municipalities. These are not easy or cheap cases, and it is therefore critical that we choose which of these cases are worth pursuing. Back to the big picture, in June 2023, China's jobless rate among youth hit 21.3% after having climbed for 6 consecutive months. This was a record high. In response to this, China stopped reporting its youth unemployment numbers, and the government made clear that anyone who discussed those numbers would be at risk of going to jail. Then, a few months ago, the Chinese government came out with a new, much lower number that was calculated entirely differently than the old one, so as to not allow for any meaningful comparisons and to render it essentially useless. To make matters worse, those who conduct their own economic research or report what they are seeing of China's economy are at risk of being imprisoned if their economic reporting is contrary to what the CCP wants people to believe. And just last week, China's State Security Ministry made clear that it would be strengthening China's economic propaganda, and it would be on the lookout for those disseminating negative views on China's economic and market prospects. Can investment banks and financial analysts go to jail for issuing sell orders or for predicting that deflation in China is likely to continue? What about warning investors that a particular Chinese company is cooking its books? Nobody really knows whether these sorts of things are going to be allowed, which is exactly the way the CCP likes it. I can tell you that I would not be giving this talk in China. It is also becoming increasingly difficult to find essential information about individual Chinese companies. If you are going to pay a Chinese company millions of dollars for goods or services, or provide a Chinese company with millions of goods or services, millions of dollars worth of goods or services, you are at minimum going to want to be sure that that Chinese company exists and is properly licensed by the Chinese government. And you also likely will want information about that company's assets, number of employees, intellectual property, government fine history, litigation history, etc. In other words, you are going to want to do your due diligence on any Chinese company with which you are contemplating doing any substantial business. My law firm used to provide this sort of what we call basic due diligence for $1,000 because it usually took us only a couple of hours. We would spend very little time getting onto and downloading government documents, and then we would spend the rest of the time interpreting those documents and crafting an English language report for our clients. We now charge $1,500 for that, and we should really be charging way more for this, considering how difficult and time consuming it has become to gather this information. China has tried to stop foreigners from being able to see this information at all, but we have convoluted methods for getting around the various government blocks. But the time and degree of difficulty has gone up, and I know many other law firms that are no longer able to get this access at all. In July, in a piece entitled Wall Street Gets a Chinese Education, the Communist Party control always trumps the needs of investors. The Wall Street Journal's editorial board stated that the big surprise from this week's slump in Chinese company stocks is that people are claiming to be surprised. President Xi Jinping has made plain for years that he intends to bring ever greater swaths of China's private economy under the state's control. Guess what, Wall Street? He meant it. That was all a quote from the Wall Street Journal, and they're right. Because for the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, the economy is a means to an end, with the end being a socialist state fully controlled by the CCP. Do not forget, Xi Jinping and the CCP are Marxists, and Marxists believe that after capitalism comes socialism, and after that comes stateless communism. China has been moving along Marxist stages of development since Mao, and Xi Jinping appears to believe China is nearing the socialism stage so it can start jettisoning more and more capitalist elements, and China's increasing restrictions on information are just one part of that. Another part of that, I just read this yesterday, is that there's an investment bank in China which anonymously has complained that they are spending 1/3 of their time reading Xi Jinping thought because they're required to do so. I mean, China is becoming more and more Marxist, and that tells me that we should not expect things to get better in China soon with respect to its economy. But not everything about China's economy going down is necessarily bad for foreign companies. China has also been beset by deflation for the last 4 months, but this has led many of its factories to reduce their prices. Last week, I wrote a blog post about how my law firm has clients that have gotten their Chinese factories to reduce product prices by as much as 25% by agreeing either to buy more product or to buy product for longer. We also have clients who have gotten 15% price reductions just by asking. I would, though, urge anyone who is seeking a factory price reduction from their Chinese factory to be very careful in doing so, because doing this incorrectly can lead your factory to determine that it no longer wants to do business with you, and just keep your molds, your money, and your IP, and whatever else you might have with them, including maybe keep one or more of your employees hostage in China. Despite all of China's problems, most of our law firm's clients that are making money in China plan to stay in China until they are no longer profitable there. I mean, why not if they're making money there? Now, a lot of them are lightening their footprint there so that they can keep making money while reducing the risk, but virtually all of them are still there. Now, as for our clients that have their products made in China, most of those companies would like to leave China, but mostly because it can be difficult to find a good substitute for a Chinese factory. Moving production entirely out of China is not going as quickly as I would have thought it would. If you had asked me in 2018, what percent of our clients would have left China by now, I probably would have said at least 50%, but it's definitely not that high. China is still a global manufacturing powerhouse with a skilled workforce that is unmatched in scale, and it still produces a huge number of products better and cheaper than any other country. But in the last year, and especially in the last 6 months, we have gotten so much new Mexico business that it would not surprise me if our Mexico manufacturing work starts outpacing our China manufacturing work by the end of this year. I mean, just last week, Mexico surpassed China in product sales to the United States. Fred, Jonathan, and I were talking about this before we went live. Yesterday, I spoke in Utah, and one of the other speakers, a professor, talked about how China was still the leading supplier of product to the United States by revenue. And I turned to another speaker and whispered, I thought Mexico surpassed China just last week. And he said yes, and I looked it up, and it's true. So that's a pretty amazing statistic, and it's a statistic most people are not aware of. And I think that's due in part to the fact that many American business people have essentially been trained not to speak ill of China, because if you're going to China, you really shouldn't be doing that. Well, in closing, my key takeaway with respect to China's economic outlook is that things are grim. From declining foreign investment to ballooning corporate and municipal debt, the warning signs are flashing red, and prudent risk management is essential. And if you're doing business in China or with China, I am not telling you to get out entirely, but I am telling you to check what you're doing and try to figure out ways to reduce your risks. Big companies are definitely doing that. Um, and we've seen a lot of companies do that since Russia invaded Ukraine. A lot of our clients have started realizing that what happened there could happen to them in China with respect to um, Taiwan. So that concludes my portion. I will turn it back over to Jonathan and Fred. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Dan. And just in terms of format, everyone, we are leaving a large chunk of time at the end of this for Q&A. We already have a good handful of questions that we got ahead of time from some of you. And I know I've seen some of you active in the chat already. So if you have any questions that come up as we're speaking, feel free to chime in. We'll keep an eye on that. And we're happy to banter about. The prepared part of our remarks is probably the least interesting part. I think what you'll enjoy is the fireworks as we dissect some of the questions that you throw at us. So my part of this presentation is it's actually gave me a really interesting bird's eye view into China's legal development, particularly over the last 15 years or so. I've been practicing law for 12 years now, and but been paying attention to China for much longer than that. And I took everyone else's work, great work. There are a lot of good think tanks out there that are keeping tabs on China's legal developments for a variety of reasons, a lot from the human rights perspective. But in terms of, I'd say, material laws that really matter to foreign companies doing business in China, there are, let's say, 20 or so on the books that really matter kind of from a global perspective. And then there are specific industry-specific laws as well. But in terms of these laws, from the time that Xi Jinping took over as head of the CCP in 2012, it's been 12 years. So basically my whole legal career. And there have been some significant revisions. China has started, if you put these all on a map or on a timeline, so the earliest laws were passed in the 80s. An acceleration in the 90s as China geared up to join the WTO, a good number that were passed in 2001, 2002 as a direct result of China joining the WTO. But I'm most interested in the laws that have been amended recently, passed or amended recently. For instance, some of the most, I'd say the scariest laws that have been passed, there have been 6 passed since 2014. 2014, the counter-espionage law, 2015, counterterrorism law, 2015 national security law, 2016 cybersecurity law, 2017, and then amended a year later, national intelligence law, and then a cryptography law in 2019. So to me, this all speaks to the risk in and around doing business in China or with Chinese companies, because we know with the social credit system in China that these are all very important enforcement mechanisms, let's call them, to get the any Chinese citizen, whether they're at home or abroad, to cooperate with state intelligence. So certainly there are issues. I've had some interesting conversations with U.S. law enforcement that are focused on China. It's called the China threat in the U.S. And these are all very real, and they happen. These don't make the news all the time. And certainly companies don't like to disclose when they've been breached or when they've had some kind of security incident. But these are real risks. So those kind of highlight, and those all were passed in 2014 to 2019. So I'd say kind of Xi Jinping coming and putting a big exclamation point in terms of what his focus is in terms of domestic security and international security, national security. Some of the other laws that have been passed or amended recently have been let's say since 2018. So forgive me for reading through this laundry list, but e-commerce law passed in 2018. Food safety law was amended in 2018. Advertising 2018. Product quality 2018. Import-export commodities amended twice in 2018. Unfair competition law 2019. Foreign investment law 2019. Electronic signature law, which made our lives quite a bit easier and probably yours too, doing business in China. Securities law was amended in 2019, and I assume we're going to see some more amendments to that as the public securities markets have not been reacting well to the news coming out of China, or the lack thereof. Trademark law 2019, and then most recently the company law was amended last year, taking effect in 2024 in July of this year. So certainly a lot of, and this is only the laws, mind you. Okay, this is not the regulations. We have laws, and then we have implementing regulations. And so maybe I need to agree to do another webinar in a month or two, and just canvass all of the implementing regulations that dovetail into these, because that's really where things happen. Even though, in China, laws are very generally written, the regulations are also quite generally written. But they're still very informative in terms of what economic policies are being enshrined in law, and enforcement policies as well. And I always love to mention this, that in every Chinese law that I've read in my career so far, I've been at the firm for about 5 years. Every one of them has a national security and public safety carve out, so that basically anything, and this is only commercial laws that I've been reading, but basically any law in China can be used as a national security shield, or the national security can be used as a shield to implement the law or enforce the law disproportionately against any companies. So that's kind of par for the course. It's always fun when I finally come across that as I'm reading these in English and Chinese, and I find the the 公共安全 carve out. So it's a lot of, I'd say it's fun, but it's academically it's fun, but realistically I don't like seeing that, of course. So in terms of the company law, I just want to focus on two significant changes. This applies to all domestic foreign invested companies in China. These center around capital contributions and corporate governance. Capital contributions typically have not been really enforced for many years. You set up a company in China, your capital contribution says 100,000 or $1 million USD or the equivalent, and you have 40 years to pay in the capital contributions. We represent some private equity clients that have done deals in China, and that always comes up, and we sometimes we adjust for it, but because it hadn't been implemented or hadn't been enforced, that was one of the items that we were okay kicking down the road. But that is not the case anymore. Under the new capital contribution requirements, companies only have 5 years within which to make sure the company is capitalized sufficiently. And unlike in the U.S., you actually have to, U.S. we can set up a company with $100. There's no capital contribution requirement or enforcement, but China has significant capital contribution requirements. So we'll still wait for the implementing rules around this, but 5 years maximum for all new enterprises. We don't know how that's going to be applied to existing enterprises in China yet. I don't know if it's scary, but it certainly is problematic for U.S. or other foreign companies doing business in China. The enforcement mechanisms for this are quite strong. So the company itself can enforce this if the capital contributions haven't been met. So the company can enforce against the owners. Creditors can also enforce against the company as well if there are commercial requirements and the company hasn't been sufficiently capitalized. And there's joint and several liability for all business owners. So if one of your shareholders doesn't pony up their capital contribution, it comes jointly and severally to all the others owners. So you need to pick your business partners wisely. And then for board members, they have to send the demand letter to the shareholders for the capital contributions that are missing, or they will be held personally liable for the contribution. And then the result is, of course, for the shareholders, that if you fail to make your capital contribution, it's very easy for the company or the board to cut you out. So as a corporate attorney, this is, depending on which side of the table I'm on, I either love or hate these requirements. So it just depends on who I'm working for, but very serious requirements. In terms of corporate governance, there was one other thing I wanted to mention. For any mid to large scale companies that are not state-owned enterprises with 300 employees or more, they have to have one employee representative on the board of directors unless they have a board of supervisors. So this was a requirement before for all state-owned enterprises, but now any company that has 300 employees or more has to have an elected employee representative on the board. So there are actually quite a few other changes that I don't have time to talk about right now, but I consider these very significant from a corporate governance perspective and from a company capitalization or foreign direct investment standpoint. So I think that's all I wanted to talk about. Certainly, we have a lot more we can talk about, but I want to save Fred some time and certainly save time for Q&A as well. So Fred, I'm going to kick it over to you.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. And just to give a little bit more context as far as my own focus, I primarily focus on intellectual property matters, as Jonathan mentioned. Also, get more involved in, or get involved more generally in manufacturing matters and other China business relationships. I lived in China for about 13 years. And during that time, I spent a few years working in the trenches of the anti-counterfeiting, or the fight against counterfeiting. So that certainly gave me a quite a perspective on not only the the risks associated with intellectual property protection in China, but just more generally the business culture in the country and the risks that accompany business activities there. So I'd like to start off by offering some thoughts on where things are as far as intellectual property protection. As Jonathan mentioned, the trademark law was amended in 2019, and last year, I believe, the um, the Chinese government basically shared a proposed draft of yet another revision to the trademark law. The public comment period for that has closed. Haven't heard anything since, but the law, the amendments as proposed, could bring some important changes to not only to trademark practice, but to the strategies that companies need to follow when doing business in China. For example, one of the proposed changes is to establish a requirement to certify use of a trademark. At the moment in China, you do not need to use a trademark in order for you to register it, and you can keep an unused trademark indefinitely, or keep that registration indefinitely, even though there are avenues for third parties to challenge that. But if no such challenge is presented, then you could potentially have a trademark registration for a trademark that you don't use for for many years. And this can be useful because you can use those registrations in defensive fashion, right? Maybe you don't want to use a particular name, but you don't want someone else using it. So this is something that might change. Uh, One of the other focus areas of the proposed amendments have to do with combating bad faith trademark applications and registrations. The most common example of bad faith in the trademark world are what are called trademark squatters. So basically, someone in China takes your trademark and registers it with the authorities before you get a chance to do it, and then once it's your turn to try to register it, you discover that someone else already did, and it can be very difficult and costly to try to get that trademark back in your own name, and sometimes it's not possible. So it's good. It's heartening to see the authorities paying more attention to this issue. There have been positive moves in this regard, but there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of making sure that um, opportunistic parties don't get to make profits out of playing with the IP of others. In On that note, it is important to mention that IP violations, IP infringements continue to be a part of the Chinese business landscape. Again, there have been positive developments in terms of enforcement, but there are still problems, and that's important to keep in mind. And for a company doing business in China or about to enter the Chinese market for the first time, it is absolutely critical to pay attention to these IP issues. You do not want to be in a situation where your lack of a registered trademark prevents you from not only selling your products but potentially entering into lucrative business relationships. So definitely on the very short list of China musts, as either you start doing business there or you assess where you are currently and what you and audit your legal needs. Some good news in terms of the speed at which trademark applications, so applications to register trademarks, are being examined. It is quite fast. In some cases, it is shockingly fast. How quickly we hear back from the China Trademark Office. It is frankly embarrassing that here in the United States, processing times have multiplied and in length and continue to do so. And of course, I understand that the Chinese government has policy tools at its disposal that our government doesn't. But still, let's just looking at the bright side, you don't have to worry about those delays in China if you're trying to register a trademark. The bad news in that regard is that we are seeing increasingly strict examination standards, especially when it comes to likelihood of confusion. That's not what they call it in China, but that's the analogous American concept. We are seeing some rather questionable and baffling results that are preventing companies from abroad from registering their trademarks in China. No one from the China Trademark Office has come out and said this, but the sense that we are getting is that the Trademark Office is adopting the viewpoint that the Chinese consumer is not going to be able to pick up on much nuance when it comes to foreign language trademarks. And there might be something to that, to be honest. I can only imagine how your average American would look at two Chinese trademarks and try to figure out whether they're similar or not. But it is, we suspect it's become a bit of a crutch for the China Trademark Office to deny trademark applications, which is something that, I mean, they don't want to deny trademark applications for the sake of denying them, but they do want to trim the size of the China Trademark Register, which, by the way, is something that USPTO wants to do as well. So just keep that in mind. More broadly, we are seeing more sophistication on the part of Chinese parties when it comes to licensing agreements. I mean, to put it very bluntly, perhaps 10 years ago, the Chinese company wouldn't have bothered to seek a licensing agreement. Licensing agreement, Chinese style, would have been for them to just start using your IP and then see what happens. So we are seeing that concept of licensing and wanting to do things by the book begin to take root in China. So I'll leave it there as far as the IP part of it. But of course, if anyone has any questions, I'd be glad to take those on. Some turning to trade more broadly, or to the China trade relationship, or the China relationship more broadly. So one of the, I mean, kind of doing what Jonathan did, I mean, in terms of placing ourselves in a historical context. I was in China when I was living in China when Xi Jinping came to power, and in a very short period of time, the changes were palpable. To be clear, China was no paradise for foreign businesses or for anyone prior to Xi Jinping's arrival, but there were definitely changes, and I think, as is often said, when someone tells you that this is what they want to do, believe them. I mean, and this, as Dan was that quote from the Wall Street Journal, that's absolutely true. I mean, look at the bios of these leaders. Look at what they write. It's very clear that they have a particular vision how they want the country to run, and they're trying to do all they can to execute that vision. I don't know if our problem is that we can't quite comprehend how someone would want that to be the vision for their country to follow, or whether we say things that we don't mean, so we assume that the Chinese are the same way. But certainly at the top levels of the CCP, this is what they want. In terms of trade, this might be a bit of an exaggeration, but only a bit. If China could stop relying on outside trade altogether, the CCP would be delighted with that. They don't see free trade as a positive objective in and of itself, as we do to some extent. So it's important to look at legal developments in China through that prism. As Dan said, we are definitely seeing quite a trend in the direction of nearshoring and its related trends. So you have reshoring, which means bringing back operations to your home country. There's ally or friend shoring, which is basically taking operations to a country that might not necessarily be that close to your home country, but which shares certain core values. And I would argue that in the case of Mexico, in addition to it being the best example of nearshoring, because we do share a 2,000-mile border with them, there is also that element of ally shoring, given the different tonic of the U.S.-Mexico relationship as opposed to the U.S.-China relationship. There's a lot we could talk about in terms of geopolitics, in terms of trade, but I would just want to focus on a couple of concrete, actionable items. So, as part of the geopolitical struggle that's going on between mainly the U.S. and China, but to a larger extent the West and China, we have seen the weaponization, is that the correct noun, of forced labor laws. Now, the U.S. has had forced labor laws on the books for a long time. This is not something new, but what is somewhat new, or very new really, is their use as policy tools in this geopolitical context. I'm pretty sure that no one but China would be getting this kind of treatment when it comes to the enforcement of forced labor laws, and we are seeing this become quite a priority. The irony is that we have forced labor problems here in the United States, and they don't seem to get nearly as much attention as the ones in China. But that's not to say that the problems in China are not serious. And whatever you think of those, of what's happening in China, whether you believe that it's exaggerated or not true at all, the U.S. government believes it's true, and that's all that matters. And you can argue all you want that this is not what the U.S. government thinks it is. But until that outlook changes, companies that import products made in China are going to have to be very careful. And not just companies that import products made in China. And I think this is sort of the new phase we're entering. Products made in other countries might have Chinese components that render them problematic. Products made in other countries might be suspected by the U.S. government of having components made in China, and that's going to be a problem for you. So definitely an issue worth keeping in mind. And this is something with the potential to affect any importer. If you think that your import volumes are insufficient to draw the attention of the government, well, I would not advise that you do that. I would not trust Chinese suppliers who say, look, we don't have a problem. You don't have to worry about this, right? So a very serious issue, no doubt. And finally, kind of looking at the big picture in terms of the economy and these woes that Dan described, we are seeing some of the manifestations of that. Just yesterday, I spoke to someone who is dealing with a dispute of the type we've been seeing for a long time. But I think now with the economic situation, the pressure on Chinese economic actors is growing, and not only on them, it's also growing on people elsewhere. So, for example, in this particular situation, the person I was talking to was facing a collusion of sorts between his main client and the factory in China, something of a circumvention issue, right? So different manifestations that can happen. So on that note, I'm going to leave it there, and I look forward to interacting more with the audience through the questions that have been posed. Thank you.
Thanks, Fred. So we've got about 20 minutes before we're done. Let's kick off with a couple of questions. First, is it safe to go to China right now? That is, everyone's asking that. And maybe, Fred, since you have family connections in Taiwan, maybe we add Taiwan as well. So is it safe to go to China and Taiwan right now?
Well, as far as Taiwan, obviously the big risk concerns what China would do, right? I mean, I think Taiwan is, one of the safest places on earth. I mean, if the Taiwanese were left to their own devices, they would continue running their country in the same wonderful way that they've been doing. But of course, it is. I mean, undeniably, it is a reality, right? Part of the problem with the whole cross straits situation is that there is that potential for miscalculation that escalates things, right? I think often when experts analyze a situation, they're looking at things in a very controlled way where, well, if this happens, then this is what the Chinese authorities are going to do. But all that could go by the wayside if you have, God forbid, some incident where planes collide, Taiwanese feel that they need to bring down a Chinese airplane. I mean, obviously, and those are things that cannot be ruled out, right? So I was watching a documentary recently about the shooting down of a Korean airliner back in '83 by the Soviets, right? I mean, clearly that's not what they wanted to do, but they did, and things had the potential to get out of hand. By the way, I also learned that was the second time that the Russians had that the Russians shut down a Korean airliner. The first time the pilot managed to land in a frozen lake and nothing happened. As far as China, I think I would summarize the risk, and I know Dan has more to say on this, but I would summarize it in the following way. I think the actual risk of getting in trouble if you go to China, if as a random American going there, I think the risk is very low, but it's not zero. And I can tell you that the risk if you go to England, the risk if you go to Canada, the risk is zero. I mean, nothing's going to happen to you just because you happen to be an American going to Canada. That risk is not zero in China, sorry. But also, and I think here is where people have to be very honest with themselves. Not everyone is going to be treated in the same way, right? So if you're engaged in a business dispute with a Chinese company, all of a sudden that changes the risk calculations, right? People like myself who've worked for the federal government, well, that is something you have to keep in mind because you don't know how the Chinese authorities are going to look. I mean, especially in the case of someone who also happens to be doing business in China. Well, people might draw conclusions that are inaccurate about what you were really doing for the U.S. government. But again, that's something on your resume that's different. If you have family in mainland China, you have to be very careful about that, right? Because obviously that's going to create pressure points that others might not have, right? Also, how valuable are your activities in China, right? I mean, sometimes I do sometimes get questions from people doing business in China who probably overestimate the risks and overestimate how much the Chinese authorities would care about them. But there undoubtedly are people out there that are going to have more complicated situations. And we know this to be true because we've seen what's happened with certain business executives and certain other people. So that's my take on it. Dan, anything you want to add?
Dan, you're muted.
I'm sorry. Well, all I will add is that it really depends on who you are. China knows who you are. They know what you've written, what you've said, what you're doing. And so if you have any reason whatsoever to believe that you might have problems in China, if you have any disputes with anyone in China, if you have any sort of background that might not mix well with China, I would recommend we perform something what we call a personal risk assessment, where we assess someone's risk. And much of the time we say it's always low risk, almost always low risk. But there are definitely times where we say, look, we found these things that you wrote. You might want to send somebody else.
I agree with that as well. It depends. Of course, we're all personally gauging our own risk. If you happen to be a writer on a blog that is sometimes critical of China's governing party, you may have to think twice about when and how you go to China and under whose invitation. Dan, what do you see about the? I think you read news. Well, actually, Fred reads a ton of news as well. What are your thoughts on this being an election year and China's current outlook in terms of a Biden win or a Trump win?
Well, I'm going to give a very short answer to that and say that it's going to be very hard to say. I mean, if Biden wins, obviously things will mostly stay the same. If Trump wins, we don't know what's going to happen. That's my view.
Okay, let's talk international, because that's what we've been thinking about a lot lately and dealing with. What is the more accurate term for what's going on now? Is it de-risking or decoupling, and what's the better strategy? And I can go first on this.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Good. In my world, it's always de-risking. Everything I do to help clients is de-risking. We're going into China, but at the same time, we're de-risking. It's all of my contracts, all the contracts that we draft, and from a commercial perspective, are drafting the marriage contract with the prenup written in the footnotes, right? So that's normal. And I see every bit as de-risking, right? And I think de-risking is absolutely the smart play. Decoupling, I think, is more of a one that gets thrown around in higher governmental circles, because anyone with any supply chain ties to China do not want to decouple, and really it's impossible. I was in a conversation with a Mexican attorney just last week, and talking about some of the inputs. Their automotive parts manufacturer. I think, Fred, you and I were on that call together. Automotive parts. And even though all of the substantial transformation for the goods is occurring in Mexico, all of the raw materials are still flowing by way of China. And so the idea of decoupling, I think, it may be just a farce. It may be not even technically feasible in the next 5 decades. But at least for, de-risking is absolutely the right way to think about all of these. And I think for companies going to Southeast Asia, going into Latin America, going into Africa as it continues to develop, I think that de-risking is absolutely what has to be topmost in your mind.
I agree. De-risking makes sense. I don't even know really what decoupling means, because people say, are we decoupling from China? And the answer is yes, we definitely are, because many companies and our government are trying to reduce our business with China. And so if you use decoupling as an ing word, then yes, we are decoupling. But I think I don't know what it means, because some people use it to mean, are we going to completely cut off everything from China? That's how you seem to use it, Jonathan. So I don't like the decoupling word, because I don't think any two people are necessarily using the same definition. Whereas de-risking, yeah, if you use de-risking, like, are you trying to reduce your risks? Then everybody's doing that, and everybody should have been doing that with every country for the last 50 years.
I agree. So, what are tangibly, what are companies doing to reduce their risks in and around China? We've touched around a few of these, but what are some things that you two are seeing in your own China work right now?
Go ahead,
Well,
Fred.
sure. I mean, sure. So, I mean, de-risking obviously is such a broad term. For example, if you want to get technical, making sure that you register your trademark in China is a form of de-risking, right? I mean, you will be not eliminating certain risks, but you will be doing a lot to minimize those risks. Having proper contracts in place with your suppliers, having proper contracts to govern the manufacturing relationship, to govern the disclosure of confidential information. All of that are, we could say, micro de-riskings, micro mitigations of risk. More broadly, of course, then you start getting into, some companies are saying, okay, fine, we're going to move all of our operations to another country. But in many instances, it really does, de-risking really captures it, because you have situations where companies are saying, okay, we're going to still manufacture in China, but we're going to go into another market as well to manufacture. Or, you know what, 15 years ago, we were basically saying, forget the rest of the world. All the handbags that we need to sell, we will sell in China. Companies now are beginning to say, okay, you know what? I think we need to start looking at other markets, and we can't rely entirely on China for our success. And not only that, we've seen what happened with Russia and the Ukraine, and it's not as unimaginable now that something like that could happen with China. So companies are saying, okay, well, we do need to, we can't put all of our eggs in that basket.
What I've seen that is
Hey, Dan,
interesting
can I
is,
jump for 1 second, Dan? There are a couple of things
sure.
that Fred raised, I think, and then I'll kick it back over to you. So one, Fred, you and I talk about this a lot, is on the trademark side, is you go straight to the China Trademark Office for filings because of potential problems. I know you mentioned that on several calls that we've been on. So that's one thing that smart people are doing, rather than go through the international protocols. The other one is, and now I've lost, so I may have to kick back over to Dan. Oh no, the other is, I'm in a transaction. I've been in a transaction recently, doing a lot of due diligence, international due diligence, looking at contracts, and companies the acquisition targets valued at 10 million plus. They're doing several $1 million worth of work, several $1 million of purchases from their Chinese supplier, all on purchase orders. They've been doing this for years. And so I'm looking through the due diligence packet, and I see only purchase orders for large amounts, regular purchases, and no master services agreement, master manufacturing agreement to govern anything if it goes wrong. It just blows my mind, some of the things that I see when I'm doing due diligence on whether I'm whichever side of the table we're sitting on. If companies are still operating on purchase orders and think that gives them some kind of security or guarantee or anything, quality control, I mean, nothing. The purchase orders are functionally a handshake across the water.
Yeah. And what I'm seeing is that in the last 3 or 4 years, we've had a number of companies have us essentially audit every single thing they're doing in China to try to reduce their risks. And in every instance, we have found some things that should reduce their risks. But what I find so interesting is the companies that ask us to do these full-fledged audits, they are the companies that are doing almost everything right. So it's not like they woke up one day and said, I need an audit. No, these are mostly bigger companies that have essentially been self-auditing every single day, and that's a problem. And it's a problem because, as Jonathan raised, there are all these companies out there that are just doing absolutely everything wrong, and then they put themselves up for sale or something happens, and it's bad for them. And so I don't know how that can be solved other than to say that if you're doing business with China, um, you should figure out um, how you can reduce. You should try to figure out what your risks are and how you can reduce them.
What can companies do to protect against forced labor violations?
That's a tough one, and I hate to sound glib, but really, the if you're looking for absolute protection against the possibility of getting dinged for forced labor violations, I mean, you'd have to decouple from China. I mean, that would and that is very tough, right? Because even if you said, well, I'm going to manufacture in the U.S. and I'm going to use materials from the U.S., it's very, very difficult to completely. I mean, if you're in manufacturing, it's going to be very difficult to completely eliminate that risk. Obviously, the closer you are to the problems, the greater the risk. So if in that scenario that I described, where you are manufacturing a product in the U.S. and you have the odd piece that comes from China, the odd component that comes from China, risks are going to be lower. But if you are manufacturing in China, getting finished products from China, you're going to have a risk. And there are the realistic answer is that there are certain indicators that you can look for that might be able to give you a sense of relative reassurance. But overall, it's very difficult to completely eliminate that risk. The best you can hope for really is to have a strong compliance program, that is honest, not just something on paper, so that if and when a problem arises and U.S. Customs starts looking at your practices, you can say, well, look, here's what we did. I mean, we genuinely tried. And it's not necessarily that they're going to say you can continue doing what you're doing. It's that they're going to say, okay, fine, we're not really going to punish you for things that happened, right? But it doesn't mean that you get to go back to business as usual. One thing to keep in mind.
Follow-up question here, Fred. How many layers deep do you have to go in the supply chain?
According to the law, you need to go all the way to the if you're making wine, you have to go to the to the grapes that were being picked. If you're making products with solar panels, you're supposed to go back to the sand that was quarried to make the materials that go into the panels. So yeah, you're supposed to be going back. And that's a challenge because your Chinese suppliers probably won't know, they'll know one tier, they'll know who the tier below them is, maybe two tiers. But if you're talking about a product that underwent transformation at different levels, that tracking, that chain of custody is going to get blurry quick.
And we've been writing those into our master services agreements lately, in the last year, especially in developing addendums for our contracts that deal specifically with forced labor, making sure that companies have forced labor, our clients have forced labor policies in place, requiring our immediate suppliers to consent to that, to consent to our audits, our information requests. And, that's, I don't think we've had any that have been pushed, at least not on my desk. I haven't had any that have been pushed beyond that level. But that is certainly the first line of defense, is making sure that from the company, you outward down the supply chain, push those legal requirements as far down as you can, and hopefully that will put you in a better position when
you need to have that. You need to have that in your contracts. I mean, that is the bare minimum, right? You need to have forced labor language in your contracts. Otherwise, I've done audits, not forced labor audits, but other compliance audits. And there is a particular kind of audit when you open your, you have your clipboard, you take a look at the checklist, you ask the first question, and the factory gives you a bad answer. Like, for example, who's the person in charge of, IP security at the company? We don't have one. It's going to be a long day. So it's the same thing. If U.S. Customs comes knocking and they say, okay, let's just start with the basics. Give us a sample of your supplier agreements. Oh, there's no mention here of forced labor. It's only going to get worse from there.
Which is why it's so dangerous to just be buying your product. Another reason why it's dangerous to be buying your product on just POs, because I don't think I've ever seen a PO with forced labor language.
No, definitely not. Dan, we've got time for one more question. We actually don't have time, but I still want to ask you. Can you comment on the bias of Chinese courts against Western companies litigating in China? Let's just say, take it as a more generality. What's the best way to litigate disputes or prepare to litigate disputes in China?
Okay. I would say that 98% of the time the courts are fair. If you're litigating over an IP dispute involving your rubber ducky, you'll probably get a fair trial. If it's involving cutting edge semiconductors or something else of a national security interest or political or military interest to China, you won't get a fair trial.
Great. Thanks, Dan. I think we had some Q&A we didn't get to. We certainly will, we can address those in future blog posts at ChinaLawBlog.com. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Hope you had a good time. I think we'll definitely make this an annual thing, and certainly we'll have other webinars this year that will address this, and maybe we'll be lucky enough to speak and see some of you in person. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.